The train arrived in the frontier town of Red Creek just before sunset, its black engine breathing smoke into the orange sky. Daniel Carter stepped down from the last passenger car carrying one worn leather suitcase and a determination that had kept him awake for 12 years. He had not returned to Red Creek since the day his younger sister, Clara, had been accused of killing a wealthy rancher named Thomas Whitmore. Daniel had always believed Clara was innocent, but he had been 22 then, too young and too powerless to fight the town's richest men. Clara had been 17 when Whitmore was found dead near his ranch. The sheriff claimed she had been seen arguing with him earlier that evening. Within hours, rumors spread through Red Creek. People whispered that Clara had wanted revenge because Whitmore had refused to sell her family's small ranch at a fair price. There was no proper investigation. The town judge accepted the testimony of two wealthy ranch hands, and Clara was sent away to a distant prison. Daniel begged the sheriff to investigate further, but nobody listened. For years, Daniel carried the shame and anger with him. He moved west, worked on cattle ranches, and eventually became a respected horse trainer in Colorado. Yet every time someone mentioned justice, he remembered Clara's face as she stood outside the courthouse window, tears running down her cheeks while townspeople stared at her as if she were a criminal. She had whispered only one thing to him that day: "Don't let them forget who I really am." Now Daniel had returned because a letter had reached him 3 weeks earlier. The letter came from an elderly former deputy named Samuel Reed. Samuel wrote that he had discovered something important before his death. He claimed the original investigation had been deliberately altered, and one witness had lied about seeing Clara near Whitmore's ranch. Daniel walked through Red Creek as memories returned with every step. The wooden buildings looked smaller than he remembered. The old saloon still stood at the corner, though its sign was faded. The courthouse remained at the end of Main Street. Daniel stopped outside it and stared at the steps where his sister had once stood. A voice behind him said, "I wondered when you'd come back." Daniel turned and saw Sheriff Eli Morgan, now an older man with silver hair and tired eyes. Daniel immediately recognized him as the young deputy who had guarded Clara during the trial. "You knew I would return?" Daniel asked. Morgan nodded slowly. "A man doesn't carry a wound like yours forever without coming back for answers." Daniel's expression hardened. "My sister carried that wound longer." The sheriff lowered his eyes. "I know." Inside the sheriff's office, Morgan brought out an old wooden box. He placed it on the desk and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of the original case records, several faded photographs, and a folded statement. "I kept these because I never believed the official story," Morgan said. "But I was afraid to speak." Daniel unfolded the statement. It belonged to a ranch hand named Owen Blake. According to the document, Owen had seen a man leaving Whitmore's property shortly after the gunshot. The man was not Clara. He was wearing a long black coat and riding a gray horse. Why wasn't this testimony used? Daniel asked. Because Owen disappeared before the trial, Morgan replied. Daniel looked up sharply. Disappeared? He left town suddenly. Nobody knew where he went. The next morning Daniel began asking questions. Most people refused to talk, but an old woman named Martha Bell finally opened her door. She had worked as a cook at Whitmore's ranch in those days. "I remember that night," Martha said. "Clara came to the ranch because Whitmore wanted to speak with her. She stayed less than 10 minutes. Then she left crying." "Did you see anyone else?" Martha hesitated. "Yes, a man named Calvin Reed." Daniel knew the name. Calvin Reed had been Whitmore's business partner. He was now one of the richest ranchers in the county. "Why didn't you tell the court?" Martha's eyes filled with fear. "Because Calvin told me my son would lose his job if I spoke." Daniel left Martha's house knowing he had found the beginning of the truth. Calvin Reed was not pleased when Daniel confronted him at the Red Creek cattle market. The older rancher looked at Daniel with cold recognition. "Your sister's case was settled years ago," Calvin said. "Justice doesn't expire," Daniel replied. Calvin laughed. "You think you can walk back into town after 12 years and change history?" "No," Daniel said. "I'm not changing history. I'm uncovering what you buried." The words wiped the smile from Calvin's face. That evening Daniel found an unexpected ally. A young newspaper reporter named Lucy Harper approached him outside the hotel. She had been investigating Whitmore's death for months after discovering inconsistencies in the old records. "I found something," Lucy said. "A bank ledger." She showed Daniel copies of financial records proving that Whitmore planned to expose Calvin for stealing money from their cattle business. Whitmore had written a letter stating that he intended to report Calvin to federal authorities. Suddenly, the murder had a motive, but they still needed proof that Calvin had been at the ranch. Daniel and Lucy traveled outside town to find Owen Blake. After days of searching, they finally discovered him living under another name in a small farming community in Kansas. Owen was old and sick, but when Daniel showed him Clara's photograph, tears filled his eyes. "I never forgot her," Owen whispered. He agreed to return to Red Creek and testify. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse was packed. Calvin arrived with his lawyers, certain that his wealth would protect him again. But this time, the truth had witnesses. Owen told the court what he had seen. Martha confirmed that Clara had left before the murder. Sheriff Morgan admitted that the original testimony had been suppressed. Lucy presented the financial records. Finally, Daniel placed Whitmore's forgotten letter before the judge. It named Calvin as the person Whitmore suspected of stealing from him. Calvin's confidence disappeared. The judge ordered an investigation, and within days authorities uncovered additional evidence proving that Calvin had arranged Whitmore's murder to prevent him from exposing the theft. The two ranch hands who had falsely accused Clara eventually admitted they had been paid to lie. Clara's conviction was officially overturned. Daniel traveled to the prison himself to bring his sister home. When Clara stepped through the gates, she looked older than the 17-year-old girl he remembered, but her eyes were the same. "You came back," she whispered. "I promised you I would," Daniel replied. Clara embraced him, and for the first time in 12 years, neither of them had to carry the weight of the town's lies. When they returned to Red Creek, people gathered along Main Street. Some lowered their heads in shame. Others apologized. Martha Bell stood among them, crying openly. Clara looked toward the courthouse and took a deep breath. "I don't want revenge," she said. Daniel looked at her. "I only wanted my name back." Months later, Clara rebuilt her life on a small ranch outside town. She taught children how to ride horses and became known for helping families who had little money. Daniel stayed nearby, finally able to live without the anger that had followed him across half the country. Red Creek changed too. The old sheriff retired. Lucy's newspaper became one of the most respected in the territory, and the town never again treated wealth as proof of innocence. Years later, a wooden sign was placed near the courthouse honoring those who had fought to reopen the case. Clara's name was written on it, not as the accused girl everyone once whispered about, but as a woman whose truth had survived 12 years of silence. Daniel often visited that sign at sunset. He had returned to Red Creek seeking justice for his sister, but he discovered something even greater. Sometimes the truth can be buried for years, but it does not disappear. And sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to come back, ask the questions everyone else was afraid to ask, and refuse to accept a lie as history.